Hello InfoPerson, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss one of the most unusual survivors in the animal kingdom. This guy, the sloth. And though we often think of sloths as lazy and not particularly exciting, in the world of biology, nothing is ever that simple. Because as you're going to find out today, their slowness is not actually some kind of a flaw, and instead is an extremely specialized surviving strategy that scientists have now just figured out and seems to be the result of something really extreme when it comes to genetics. And so recently, a team of researchers whose study you can find in a description successfully sequenced the genome of a species referred to as two-toed sloth, discovering something super unexpected. It turns out that the sloth's extreme lifestyle is powered by a strange genetic phenomenon involving what we refer to as jumping genes, and something that for many decades biologists refer to as junk DNA, or something that scientists thought was maybe not that important. But as you're going to find out from this video, that does not seem to be the case. And so let's talk about these discoveries and what this means for our understanding of evolution and DNA, and how one day this discovery might potentially help us as well. But to understand the genetics, we first have to take a look at the animal itself. So a sloth, technically a part of a group called Xenarthra, which actually includes some other strange animals such as armadillo and anteaters. But out of all animals on the planet, these guys are known for their slowest possible metabolism, or basically slowest metabolism for any mammal, very often at least half of what you would expect for an animal of a similar size. And that's mostly because of their diet, because they mostly eat leaves, which actually provide very little energy. They had to become the masters of conservation, and so they do spend approximately 90% of their time completely motionless. But it's not just what they do, it's also what's happening inside, and in this case, even their bodies can physically control their temperature, fluctuating with the environment in order to save as much energy as possible. This is actually referred to as heterothermy, an ability of animals to switch from being warm-blooded to cold-blooded pretty much at will. And well, it turns out that pretty much all of this is the result of something that happens inside their DNA to the extent that we've never seen before anywhere. And specifically, even though on the outside they're basically barely moving, in contrast their DNA is surprisingly busy. But here we have to understand a few concepts just so that it all makes sense. And that's because in this case, we're not actually talking about creation of proteins or even the DNA strand itself, but a concept referred to as transposable elements, or TEs. In more common terms, these are usually referred to as jumping genes. And in essence, just like this image shows you, there are DNA sequences that can literally change their position on the DNA strand or even copy and paste themselves into a different part of the genome. In other words, they can leave one part of the DNA and end up on the other part. And here there's a very specific type of a TE referred to as a retrotransposon. These usually work by turning their DNA into RNA and then back into a new piece of DNA that inserts itself elsewhere. And when this process results in a duplicate copy, where the whole gene is basically copied entirely, biologists usually call this a retrocopy. Once again, this image kind of shows you how this works. And well, after decades of research, for the most part in most of the animal genes, they usually don't seem to do anything, which is why in many textbooks these are usually referred to as junk DNA. They were basically kind of dismissed, even though there are quite a lot of them in a typical genome. But because many of these copies are usually broken down and don't really do anything at the end, there hasn't really been a lot of research on their actual purpose. However, what we're learning now is that apparently at least some of these types of genes can actually be kind of domesticated, or basically the organism may find a way to use all of this junk in some very unexpected ways and very beneficial ways, essentially helping itself in the process. And so in this case, we seem to have the first mammalian example where this junk DNA seems to do something very important. And so here in this study, researchers actually analyzed different species of sloths, and of course their cousins, in a process discovering that sloths seem to have the highest number of these retrocopies in any mammalian species known to us. And while most mammals seem to have a few hundred to maybe a few thousand of these gene copies, the two-toed sloth contained 16,000, with scientists discovering 38 specific retrocopies that seem to show clear signs of being domesticated, or essentially being used for some kind of a purpose inside the sloth. And on top of this, they also discovered that when it comes to the age of these genes, which was done by looking at the mutations in them, there was a clear starting point approximately 30 million years ago, when the ancestors of modern sloths very likely evolved, implying that this particular strategy very likely started at least 30 million years ago and seems to have been extremely efficient. But the question is, so why exactly do they have so many jumping genes, and what do they possibly do in their body? Well, here, by analyzing the original parent genes, scientists discovered a pattern. A lot of them seem to be connected to mitochondria and metabolic pathways, suggesting that they seem to act on mitochondria, or the powerhouses of the cell. And since mitochondria generate energy and even the body heat, in these animals, it appears that some of the main mitochondrial genes very likely changed over time, allowing some of these jumping genes to step in and to basically become a kind of a control system and a backup system, implying that they seem to control mitochondria directly and thus allow these animals to control the amount of energy that's being generated. In other words, the sloth uses its junk DNA to create a kind of a specific genetic toolkit that then supports its extremely low energy lifestyle. And here, if none of this makes sense yet, let me, use some kind of an analogy. Legos. Imagine you're building a Lego set, but instead of just following the manual, you basically keep finding these random extra pieces in the box that sometimes fit and sometimes don't. But in most cases, you basically figure out how to use these extra pieces to snap them onto your model and to make your model just a little bit more efficient, allowing it to do something really cool that would not be possible before. And while here in this Lego analogy, those extra pieces are those junk DNA genes, and sloths are basically these Lego masters. And so compared to most animals here, sloths seem to have found a way to use some of these extra copies of this junk DNA to help their bodies manage energy and to run their metabolism in a very specific, extremely efficient way. And so here sloth is not just changing its own original DNA blueprint, which basically still contains the same proteins, but instead they evolved a way to hack their own DNA to add a lot of these extra copies with specialized instructions. And this type of a use of junk DNA has actually never been seen before in any animal. But the next question is, of course, so why would this matter to us? Well, first, there's of course the theoretical reasons. This changes how we view genome evolution and shows us that jumping genes aren't just some kind of a junk DNA or even some kind of a mistake, but can actually be a primary driver for an animal's most extreme adaptation. In other words, this retrotransposition is an actual tool used by sloth to control their bodies, which of course also rethinks this idea of junk DNA as being useless. Even though it does not code for proteins, this study proves that it seems to be functional and potentially does something in most of us. And while in sloth, at least 49% of these retrocopies seem to be used for something. And so it's definitely not junk DNA and seems to be quite functional. But more importantly, this has a very important implication for medical innovation, because many human conditions such as diabetes, muscle wasting, and a lot of neurodegenerative diseases are very often linked to problems in how we manage our energy and mitochondrial issues. And so by studying what happens inside the sloth cell and seeing how they're able to basically control their energy and are actually even able to live in very low energy conditions without getting sick, we might find biological solutions for many of these human health issues and might one day map exactly how these retrocopies can also be domesticated inside humans, potentially helping us create new innovative types of medicine. As a matter of fact, some of these studies might even help us understand how to help humans hibernate. For example, for some kind of a long-term space mission, if one day we want to travel to Mars without expending too much energy. And so here, by finding ways to safely lower metabolic rates, and by basically learning how sloths do it, humans one day might be able to benefit from this as well. And lastly, this also provides us with this concept of genetic adaptation versus genetic architecture. As in, it's a kind of a counterpoint to the idea that less is more. And so while many mammals evolved by streamlining their genome, or by basically making their genome extremely effective, sloths sort of did the opposite. Their genome became heavier and became overloaded with these redundant jumping genes that are now basically helping them control a lot of things. And so for at least some specialized animals like sloths that live in very specific environments, having these messier genomes can be a massive advantage. And so yeah, being a sloth and being slow and lazy does not mean unsuccessful. Because as these animals show us, they were able to successfully survive for at least 30 million years using these very unusual and very specific genetic adaptations. And so it turns out that the secret to being the slowest animal on Earth was actually by having the most active and most chaotic genome of all mammals known to us. They look very slow on the outside, but inside, everything is super crazy. But on that note, once we discover something else about how DNA works, or even something else about sloths, we'll come back and talk more about this in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.